Hey everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. I'm so excited to talk to Roshi Joan Halifax, and we're talking about a book that will be coming out May 1st. So it hasn't even hit the bookstore yet, but we're going to be talking about some of the concepts that she's going to be talking about when she comes to visit us in Seattle on April 12th. And she's going to be here on Friday and Saturday talking about her book and then doing a workshop on compassion. So welcome. It's so great to have you here.
CJ, it's a joy. And you look great. I mean, you look like you just got out of a yoga class.
Yes, that sweaty
Indeed.
glow, that sweaty
Yeah.
reddish glow is from literally running out of a yoga class that ended much later than I thought. There's nothing like running, getting all relaxed and then going, I'm late and running from your yoga class. But I think it's actually the perfect way to segue into your book, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet, because here I am in this beautiful yoga class, feeling all altruistic and open. And then, like, the minute I know that I'm late, I start, everything closes down, I start running down the street.
Welcome to the club.
Okay, so I love these. You talk about five characters: altruism, empathy, integrity, and respect and engagement.
And
Which are five characters, and five. How would you describe?
characteristic, their virtues or characteristics, they are really important for ourselves as individuals. They're essential for our social well-being, the well-being of this earth. And also altruism, empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement all have shadow sides.
Mm-hmm.
And I call these virtues edge states because we fall over the edge easy enough and cause ourselves a lot of difficulties and cause others a lot of difficulties.
I'm right there
So,
with you.
yeah.
All right, so altruism is, you describe it as someone who, when we are taking care of others, we're protecting others, we're feeding others, we're giving of ourselves to others. And the shadow side of that is when we have sacrificed too much. And I wanted to talk to you about when you've seen, because I know you've done a ton of work with in the Himalayas and working with people who are practitioners working with people who are dying. You've worked with the dying yourself. I think in those particular circumstances, it's so easy to sacrifice too much. In your own experience or what you've observed by other people, how do you know? How does one? What are the cues that you have sacrifice too much?
So I think the first thing is actually there are two things
Okay.
that can happen that are pretty, of equal value. One is that we become exhausted and we experience burnout, or that we suffer in ways that are unusual for us, or that we become depressed, or that we feel futile. And that what we're doing is harming ourselves or potentially harming others or even harming the institution we're working in or
Mm.
even harming the institution or the nation that we're trying to serve.
Mm-hmm.
So we notice the suffering. If we don't, someone else will. And that's what's really interesting. Pathological altruism really becomes clear to others often before it's clear to us, before we realize it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the things that we learn as, humanitarians, as CEOs, as educators, as clinicians, is to listen deeply to feedback. What are others telling us about our behavior that might be really helpful in transforming that behavior into a more healthy direction?
Mm. Yeah,
So
so
pathological altruism is really a fascinating edge to fall over.
yeah.
Or altruism is a fascinating edge to fall over into pathological
Yeah,
altruism.
and I love the word pathological altruism because it's so counterintuitive. You're like, how could altruism be pathological? But it's when we start harming ourselves during that process.
Right? But not just ourselves, our endeavors to help others, could actually harm others.
Right. Do
Our
you
endeavor,
mean, yeah, give me an example of what you mean by that, because you've mentioned that
well,
several times.
yeah, for example, let's say that a person is sitting across from you who has just lost their mother, and that person that's sitting across from you is crying inconsolably. And all of a sudden, you start patting that person on the back, saying, it's okay, and it's time to get over it. And you're trying to do the right thing. But what it is basically taking the space of grief away from a person who needs to mourn.
Mm.
That would be pathologically altruistic.
Mm.
There's another term that's used here that's kind of interesting: selfish pro-social behavior. So in this
Wow.
example, isn't that a fun term?
Yeah.
That comes out of the work of Daniel Batson and Nancy Eisenberg, both of whom are social psychologists. But that's not the only way that it happens. It might happen that, for example, you're a clinician with sitting with a person who's gravely ill, and you think that you've got the best idea for the next intervention to extend that person's life.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, that person wants to let go. That person doesn't want to have more chemotherapy. He's done. He's finished. He just wants to die peacefully and not to have that kind of toxicity in the body. And you think you're doing your best as a clinician, but your patient actually is being subjected to another intervention that just causes more suffering.
You, in one of the interviews that you did, you talked about a woman that came into the clinic, and there was an imminent solution, but it would require maybe having her transferred to another clinic, and she didn't want to do that, even if it would save her life. And it really made me pause, thinking, "Oh my gosh, what would you do?" Where
Right.
it's maybe a flight away or a bus ride away to get better, but she's chosen not to. How did you? How did your team wrestle with that situation?
The team was really sensitive. They listened deeply to what she was saying and her husband. The fact is that this woman broke her neck. This was in the very remote area of Nepal, and she fell off her roof and broke her neck.
Wow.
And it was really powerful to see, this little entourage of people coming into camp with this man carrying a woman on his back. And she was futile. She was completely discouraged. She didn't want to eat because she couldn't defecate. She didn't want to drink because it was hard for her to urinate. She had heard about someone else who had been evacuated with a similar problem and had died in Kathmandu. So if she was going to die, she wanted to die with her family.
Wow.
And our team, I was very moved by how the clinicians worked with her. There's a palliative care nurse there. She taught the husband how to catheterize her and to give her an enema. She was given some medications that would enhance her appetite. She was given a lot of love, support, and counseling. But also, their wishes were not ignored. That is what they
Oh,
want. And,
interesting.
of course, I wanted to have them evacuated,
Right.
have a helicopter in and take them out and take them to Kathmandu. Now, CJ, amazingly enough, 2 years later, that is this fall, when we went back into the same region, I come around a bend in the trail, and there is that woman standing up,
Wow.
leaning against a cane. And
Wow.
um,
Oh my
I,
gosh.
I, we both cried.
Oh my
And
God, that's amazing. Wow, my God, I'm just getting my whole body is flushed. Oh my God.
it just really completely
Mm.
blew my mind. And so we sat with her. I sat with her with a translator, and she just expressed so much gratitude. And the situation had been that her husband ended up deserting her.
Oh no.
She then was taken to her brother's house. Her brother was very kind. Her appetite had returned as a result of the meds that she had been given. Her spirit kind of returned along with her appetite. And she persuaded her brother to take her to India to have surgery. And she didn't have everything back. It wasn't as if she was totally healed by any means, but she had enough to actually walk on the trail down the mountain to meet us because she heard the clinic was coming back. It just was one of those stories where you just feel you never really know what will really serve.
Yeah.
And then I didn't expect her to live, but she did.
Yeah.
And part of what drove her back into life was having her appetite return.
Mm.
And that was, our contribution, I think, was twofold. One was having the right medicine, and two was respecting her, loving her, connecting with her, and following her wishes.
That is true altruism, isn't it? Versus trying to give what you think would be the right
Yeah.
cure for her is having her follow her own innate wisdom, which was to wait, go to India. I mean, that is just such a beautiful story. Another characteristic you talk about is empathy, which you describe as experience of resonance with another. And you talk about maybe taking someone's perspective as an example of empathy, a cognitive
Right.
empathy, or sometimes you feel someone's emotions like, well, that would be hard to have someone pass. Then you talk about something that's called mirror touch
Synesthesia.
synesthesia. I think I have that, but tell me what that is.
Well, it's just actually, CJ, I read about this in some research papers toward the end of writing the book, and so I was really happy to be able to include this in the book. It's about a group of very unusual individuals who have somatic resonance with others, high sensitivity. And so what others are experiencing physically, they also experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the example that I gave of someone who has mirror touch synesthesia is of this neurologist from the East Coast. He's actually Cuban, comes from a Cuban family, very sensitive. He works all over the hospital, in this hospital in Massachusetts, where he is a kind of resource for clinicians who can't quite figure out what's going on in their patient's experience. So this doctor goes in and sits with these patients and relates with them in a clinical way, but he's experiencing what they experience, but in his own body. He increases his subjectivity to include them in his own somatic experience.
Mm-hmm.
Now, usually what happens for people who experience mirror touch synesthesia is that they are overwhelmed by information and they kind of shut down. But this particular individual, this remarkable doctor, is able to regulate his feelings in a way that doesn't become sick because of what his patients or these other patients are experiencing. And I think it's a really inspiring example of how somatic empathy. This is the case, for example, of a nurse who turns her patient so sensitively that the patient isn't suffering.
Mm-hmm.
It's the case of a mother who knows when her baby's hungry. She can just feel that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this happens on a spectrum, with individuals. Some people are very sensitive somatically, and other people are rather don't have that sensitivity at all.
Mm-hmm. I have the sensitivity where if I'm talking to a client, I'm a life coach. And so when I'm talking to them, I'll say, breathe, breathe, because I literally feel like they're not breathing and I can feel it. And it's actually hard to be with them
Yeah.
and sometimes I wait because they have some long thing that story or something that they need to tell me and process out loud. And while they're telling me, I can literally feel my chest compressing. And I don't want to interrupt them because it interrupts the flow, but I sit there and then afterwards I'm like, okay, take a breath. Or
Mm-hmm.
I try to get at the thing that I think may be moving them to a different perspective, and then I can feel like their breath coming back. And it's very hard actually to be in that. It's a gift because like the gentleman from Massachusetts, like he can actually go in and probably say, oh, I know you're focusing on this, but I feel something in his lower back. I don't know if he's at the level where
Yeah.
it's a felt sensation, or he's like, no, you should give him a IV drip, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't know
No,
where he's at.
but I think just as you describe it, it's a felt sensation. This is what
Yeah.
he describes.
Yeah.
And you can imagine, because this is a sensitivity that you have, how important it is to learn how to ground yourself, to have a kind of metacognitive perspective where you say internally, well, I'm not this person, even though I'm experiencing these sensations. Or you could say, if I asphyxiate on the spot from not breathing, that's not going to help my client. So you check your
Yes.
motivation.
All right, so for me, I'm thinking about how do I actually, whether it's being too self-sacrificing too much, which is something that I'm guilty of, or sometimes getting having this mirror touch synesthesia, whatever I can't pronounce
Synesthesia.
synesthesia, if I'm in that domain. And for me, I don't notice any of those things unless I'm meditating. I'll tune in and go, wow, there's something, or journaling, or kind of
Oh,
touching base. So that's when I notice it. But how do you train other people to notice those things? Because sometimes you don't even know that
right.
you, 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 you go into a different place. So it's not that I'm depressed. I'm just tired because I haven't been getting enough exercise. Or, you don't go to the I've been sacrificing too much. It's something that you kind of arrive to with kind of some thought and contemplation. But the easier things are to point to the other reasons why you're, burnt out, tired, exhausted, overstimulated. So how do you really get attuned with what is really going on?
I think in part has to do with your intention. Just keeping that intention of how do I serve, and how do I also not become so overwhelmed that I can't really be of any use in this interaction, that I
Mm-hmm.
might even be harming this other person. So one is, keeping your intention very active in front of you, just like, okay, I have to remember why I'm doing this. I'm not doing this to be overwhelmed. I'm doing this to be of service. And that is interacting with the client. Another is how we ground ourselves. It's using, as you know, and I'm sure so many of our listeners know, that using the breath as a way to really sweep the mind and to allow ourselves to drop into who we really are
Mm.
and to get grounded and to be resourced from that kind of attentional experience of attentional balance.
Is it too much to ask to just step us through quite a quick little example of how someone may do that during the day when they're feeling ungrounded? Because some
Yeah.
people may not know how to do that.
Well, at your in breath,
Okay.
at the next in breath, gather your attention, which means to actually let go of all of the distractions that are attracting you. So it's bringing your attention to rest just on the experience of the inhalation. And then on the exhalation, drop into the body, a kind of internal gesture where you're letting go or relaxing for just the phase of an exhale. So on the inhale, gathering your attention, and on the exhale, drop into the body, softening the shoulders. And next inhale, really gathering your attention. Exhale, dropping into the body.
Mm.
And what we say, this is from the point of view of neuroscience, and your whole face has changed just doing these few
Mm-hmm.
breaths. But what we say is we're instantiating it. We're creating the neural pathways or the patterns in the body associated with this attention, quality of attention that's really grounded.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think if there's one thing that I'm guilty of, 9 out of 10, it's being ungrounded because I'm either in my head, on the iPhone, on my phone, thinking about concepts. And so just kind of getting in the body and dropping
Right.
in, I think. And that took probably 2 minutes to do.
Well, it sometimes, as you practice it, it's shorter. You
Mm-hmm.
can do this on one inhale.
Mm-hmm.
And, CJ, it's about being really grounded and being able to be in a quality of presence for your patient, your child, your parent, your staff, how to be completely grounded and present for another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like it. All right. So, you talk about suffering. We're going back to empathy, but suffering from a moral perspective. So, say you have so much empathy for, you see bombs that happen across the country. You just see all these things, and it's hard to feel like, or sometimes a friend of mine, when there's an earthquake or some giant calamity, he actually, because he has the same mirror touch thing, he basically he wakes up and he just feels, flustered because he feels all the pain and suffering and chaos of the world. So, how can you not take on that suffering? Because there is a suffering that's caused by this moral perspective related to empathy.
So I think that it's a little bit what I have just said. One is by grounding,
Mm-hmm.
two is by remembering your attention, three is to realize, and this comes right out of social psychology, that if we don't make some degree of distinction between self and other, if we fuse too much with the experience of another, we'll get overwhelmed.
Mm,
And that doesn't help.
mm,
And so it's having a metacognitive perspective,
mm-hmm.
being able to step out of our kind of habitual practice of fusing, of total identification, and to say, I feel this person's suffering and I am not this person.
Mm, mm. And what do some of the Buddhist teachings say about self and other, or are there any Buddhist teachings around this area of kind of either self-sacrifice or empathizing, like people who love too much?
Right. Actually, Buddhism does not promote the process of self sacrifice, although there have been Buddhist martyrs, of course, trying to bring our attention, like Thich Quang Duc from Vietnam in the mid 60s, to the tragedy of the war in Vietnam. But in general, Buddhism is averse to us engaging in any activity that causes harm to ourselves or harm to others.
Mm,
So we don't do that.
mm,
And that's number one. And number two is, from one point of view, it's like every snowflake is unique. Every raindrop is unique. And yet, every wave is unique. But the waves are all water.
mm-hmm.
So, you're seeing things from two perspectives. One perspective is really appreciating the uniqueness of this moment or of this person or this situation. And the other perspective is to drop into the kind of ocean of not only interconnectedness, but also of freedom, of boundlessness, of
Mm,
emptiness.
mm, mm. And so let's say that I have someone who's dying. And so I'm kind of caught up in the moment of, here's this person who's not doing well. I'm worried about them. And so how do I reach a point of freedom? I understand the grounded piece. We've covered that. But how do you reach that point of spaciousness and taking this metacognitive perspective?
Yeah, I think practice helps. Meditation is a process of mind training that deepens our attention into the experience of insight. And wisdom will tell us.
Mm,
Wisdom will tell us we're deeply interconnected, but also we're distinct.
mm,
And, part of it comes from experience. And that's why I call these states, these that we've been talking about, of altruism, empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement. I call them edge states because when we fall over the edge, for example, and we move into the fraught side of, say, empathy, we learn a lot. And we build strength by pulling ourselves out of the grip of empathic distress.
Okay, so the other one of the characteristics is like integrity. And I love how you break this down into 4 different levels. There's moral distress, where you can see what needs to be done, but you can't follow a course of action that's beneficial. There's moral injury, which is when you engage in or see acts of egregious harm and you're traumatized or feel ashamed. There's moral outrage, which provides a mixture of anger and disgust when one perceives egregious harm towards another, and moral apathy, kind of when we have a bubble of protection, where the society is kind of making this a norm, and we kind of become numbed out from something that is actually quite wrong. So, how do you know? And I think I really look at today's politics and Facebook as just a demonstration of all 4 of these. All 5, 4, yeah, all 4 of these. But what do you observe in the dialogue today? I mean, there's some things like the Me Too that I've saw an article where you're talking about the Me Too and how that's a beautiful bursting of this bubble of apathy, this moral apathy.
But it's also, many women who have been sexually violated or suffered sexual harassment have experienced moral injury. They've experienced moral distress. If they experience moral distress, it means that they feel basically paralyzed. They see a way out of it, but they can't affect it because people aren't ready to listen. They experience moral injury because they feel shame for having been violated. They now experience, and I should say we, because I've also been subjected, probably you have, we experience, now we're in moral outrage because, we're sending our voices and we're saying no more.
Right.
And, many people experience in relation to sexual harassment and sexual violence moral apathy, which means that they've just shut down. They've just fallen into addiction to cover their pain. So, Me Too is mobilizing a tremendous amount of energy out of this transgressive situation that is about gender violence. It's not only violence toward women at the sexual level, it's violence toward, all sexual persuasions.
Right.
And it's really powerful what's happening right now because it's a change in culture that has been a millennia coming. And it is, when the women call out and we stand together around an issue like sexual violence, then we can actually force change within the ground of our culture. And it's now. And it's going to affect gender relationship, gender identity. It's going to affect politics. More and more women are going to be stepping into the political arena, into places of power, and try to bring the kind of integrity into the social and political domain, which has been primarily controlled by men. Now, this is not to say that all men are guilty. This is not the case at all, and women are also have sexually harassed and so on and so forth. But the general meme and the general trend is, of course, violence toward women and violence toward girls. And so we're in the process of an extraordinary phase shift in our culture, and there is going to be an increasing intolerance of the kind of imbalance between males and females and people of other sexual persuasions. The imbalance to bring into balance our relationship with all genders, all sexual persuasions, and to put an end to any kind of sexual violence.
What's hard is that I've seen lots of different, and I really don't even know if there is one right way of doing this. But I was at a women's conference, and there was a young gal, and she stood up and she said, I'm just so tired of fighting my brothers and friends and to make them see that this is just wrong. Like, I'm exhausted. And there was kind of a trembling in her voice. And I thought, well, she really is distressed. And I thought, wow, I don't really know what to think. Part of me thought, well, just stop fighting. I mean, maybe you need to love your brothers and understand that and maybe instead of schooling them, understand that there's this change and they're transitioning. I wasn't really sure how to react, but I knew that she was actually at the point that she was suffering as a result
Yeah.
of fighting for this so much, and this kind of moral outrage and perhaps moral injury. Like perhaps she was herself, physically abused in some way, shape, or form. Like you said, most of us have been. How does one manage this so that we don't, and it almost in ways that it seems like that we don't recreate what we have been subjected to. So now we have the gavel and we have the power and the ability to seek justice. So how do women do this in a way that doesn't harm others, doesn't implicate someone as guilty immediately, or takes,
Right.
I feel like we're in a really interesting time, and I myself am having problems trying to navigate what the right path is for me. But what are your thoughts?
Well, we are in a very complicated time and a very interesting time. And it's a time where we have to be extremely attuned to our own situation to know when we're actually violencing ourselves by sending our voice in the world.
Right.
But the other thing, there's another way we violence ourselves is to remain silent. And
Mm-hmm.
that's been true of racism.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a matter of us gaining the kind of wisdom through self-attunement and also through having relationships that are honest with good people. I tell you, when women stand together, when people stand together, and what was just amazing about the marches on January 20th and 21st was here in Santa Fe, half the march was populated by men.
Mm-hmm.
And I was saying yes. And then a year ago, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's really powerful
Mm-hmm.
that we have to stand together as human beings, not
Mm.
only as women, but as human beings.
Mm-hmm. So I think that that's when you talk about good relationships that stand together as human beings. I mean, men are going through this transitional state as well, right? Where
Yeah.
once what was okay and good is now not okay and bad, and they're going through a transition. I think trying to, in some ways, go, yeah, I guess it was obvious that it wasn't good, but I don't, somehow it was because of this moral apathy. I just was okay with it, so I think that there's a transitional state. I think that's happening for men.
CJ, I feel like the process and principles of nonviolence are something that we
Mm-hmm.
need to study and actualize at this time
Mm-hmm.
more than ever before. And whether this has to do with gun control,
Mm-hmm.
or whether it has to do with sexual violence, or the prison industrial system, or wars, or how we are with our spouse, or how we are with ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that what Dr. King was speaking about in the 1960s is really very much in our presence today. That is, how do we practice and realize nonviolence?
And are there current examples where you think, wow, that the way that X person handled the Me Too, or the way that Y person handled the gun control, it was just done with such beauty and grace in a way which brought people together. Have you seen evidence of that?
I think that these young people in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School who sent their voices and insisted in a way that was very cogent, that was unswerving, that was filled with love, that was also filled, how they sent their voice was also filled with grief. And they became, for me, living examples of a kind of movement emerging today that is directed toward the ending of violence.
Yeah, so it's actually when the violence occurred, standing together, telling their stories, and having a mix of different reactions, whether it's rage or upsetness or love or sadness or
But
grief.
they had, there was tremendous wisdom in those young people. And they were metabolizing the fraught, internal states that they were experiencing for the good of the greater community. And I'm speaking about our whole nation. And so often we would, in those kind of circumstances, we would shut down or we would move into moral injury. These kids moved into a kind of moral outrage that became wisdom and has become a political and social movement in our country. And I'm totally inspired by them.
Yeah, that's a great example. What did you mean by self-attunement? What's you talked about good relationships and connecting together as community. What does self-attunement mean?
It's that capacity to know what our experience is physically, to know our emotional experience, and also to be self-aware of our own thoughts, our cognitive experience, how we frame things, how we view things, how we see things.
Okay.
So that's what I mean by self-attunement.
Okay. So in the case of the Me Too, it may be that I have moral distress. I mean, I actually have moral distress in these situations. I have a hard time speaking up for myself, just generally, and then just in those particular cases. And then I've had more. I don't know if I've had traumatized, but I think because I'm so shut down, I don't necessarily have moral injury. But it's knowing that self-attunement to then know what the appropriate next step is, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. All right. Because if I'm speaking from a place of well, first of all, I'm probably not speaking if I'm in a place of moral distress. If I'm speaking from a place of moral injury, it probably comes off in kind of a different kind of form, maybe even not
Right.
necessarily a wise form like you described.
Well, hardly. I mean, usually you are in the position of a victim when you're suffering from moral injury. So you feel victimized, and there's a lot of self-pity and, all justified. But still, it is not necessarily going to transform the conditions that have given rise to your victimization.
I see. So if you approach an issue with moral injury, you're not you haven't necessarily resolved and healed yourself. So it comes off in a way
Hardly.
that doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily
Yeah.
create the good relationship that you're talking about.
Right.
I don't know if moral distress, you just basically don't say anything, so you're not harming, aside from harming yourself, because you have something that's of harm and you haven't necessarily, I don't know, given love to yourself. Is that the next step if you feel?
Well, I think many of us, a good part of the country feels moral distress in relation to our political situation. There is such incivility. There's also, great complexity around the situation in Russia. We don't know what's going on. We feel that, we see a way through to restore civil society or restore our country to civility, and yet we can't affect it. Well, some of us will affect it because we'll, go out and get people to vote. We'll send our voices in the world, but it doesn't mean we'll get our way. So, moral distress is you might see the way through. For example, will, the impeachment of a political official actually resolve the problem, or is there something deeper that's become visible in our country at this time? And you mentioned social media, about how our social media is actually shaping our values at this time. And who controls social media? Well, it might be the former Soviet Union, but it also could be corporations.
Right.
The corporate values, to a certain extent, have populated our consciousness,
Yeah.
colonized us in a way.
Right.
So, how do we take our lives back and then, create the conditions in our world for a fundamental transformation in values toward the good?
I think you could have like 5 or 6 interviews on just integrity. All right. I want to talk to you about, if we can, in the next 10 minutes talk about some of the other ones. One is respect. And you brought up something that I realized I was guilty of, and I thought, oh wow, this is so interesting. It's when you disrespect another who's actually trying to help you, and so you talk about examples of perhaps actually hurting a nurse or physician or speaking
Right.
to them in a dismissive way when you're in hurt or in pain. And so I didn't do that, but I basically was talking to a customer service person at T-Mobile who was feeling like I've actually have been tortured. I've been traumatized with these T-Mobile folks. However, I was being disrespectful, and I even said at one point I had the level of awareness that I'm really sorry. I realize it's not actually you that I'm mad at, but I'm just mad right now, and I'm not sure what to do. And you're not helping me. And so it was that kind of rudeness, right? He or she is in customer service. They were trying to help me, but I was feeling so agitated and irritated that I couldn't get to a place of true respect. So and I think that there's two levels. One is like, how can that person who's being disrespected create proper boundaries? And how, when you're in that situation where I was just so hyped up about the injustice of T-Mobile that I was going AWOL. What is your advice on how to cultivate respect when you're on the edge?
Well, again, we go back to this process of grounding, and then there's perspective taking. It's like including this person into your awareness, expanding your subjectivity to include them, and just sense into what they may be feeling, just as you did. It was great. You said, oh, this poor person, customer service, but I'm, sitting here being basically bullying this
I'm
person.
being a jerk, frankly. I can admit I was being a jerk. I was past the edge.
Yeah. But what's great is you recognize that.
Yes.
But at the time you also apologize, which is really good. And this is a process of learning all the time, CJ. I mean, we're kind of in a rushed, impatient world, and we're in a world where probably to get to that customer service person, you had to push how many buttons to get a human being at the other end of the line. And by that time, you're just fed up.
Yeah, but it's not their fault, right? Like, they didn't design that system. They weren't, so I definitely see that it's not right. But then, okay, so actually let's flip it to the side of the customer service person, because in some ways they're unempowered. Someone's, yelling and screaming at them, which I assume after I hung up the phone, I thought, I feel so sorry for these. I would hate being customer service. This must just be the most awful job, including being a nurse or a doctor, where you're actually in a place of healing and loving the person, trying to help, and they're yelling at you. So how can you create proper boundaries at that time?
Well, I think you also, if you're a person who's being abused by a customer or a patient or a student, you have to recognize that the state of mind they're in is also suffering. And you don't personalize.
Right. This is not about me.
Right.
Ah.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think if you were at that stage, even when I've had clients that have gone sideways, actually I've been in mediation. What they're talking about, actually some other person that they're mad at, and they're telling the stories of this other person, but they're so enraged that you feel it's like a big freight train, boom, like hitting you with their anger and rage. Even though it has nothing to do with you, it's still very hard to it's going back to this empathy, because you feel it and it's like, wow. This is not about me, but you still feel it, and it's hard. I mean, I don't know. I feel sorry for these customer service people. I don't know how they do it.
Well, just feeling sorry for them is, a way of experiencing compassion, and then maybe that insight will have you treat the next customer service person.
I think it will. I mean, just even this conversation.
A little more graciousness.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of being aware, so that next time this happens, you don't necessarily, you understand that a bigger metacognitive perspective, right? It's not their fault. They're actually customer service. They're trying to help you. Okay. And then the last area that you have in your book is engagement. And you bring out this really and you said that you've been studying burnout, which I think is fascinating because it's such a big issue. Um, tell us a little bit about, and then you said the ultimate question is asking, how can I have a livelihood that benefits others and doesn't harm myself or others, which
Yeah.
I think is a perfect question. But what's your kind of in the last couple minutes, 5 minutes, what are your thoughts about burnout and how we can prevent ourselves from burning out so that we can be more engaged in the world?
Yeah. I offer some perspectives at the end of that section where I talk about the importance of seeing work as an aspect of our actual practice, of our mental training. This is a place for meditation. Like, for example, I'll be cleaning up my room and I'll be sort of hurried, and then I'll slow down and I'll begin to do things differently. Number two is understanding that the work we do is our livelihood. And in Buddhism, we talk about right livelihood. Are we involved in a livelihood that is of service, of benefit to others? Or are we in a livelihood that is engaged in harming others? Is the place that we're working, the actual culture that we're working in, toxic or healthy? If it's toxic and we can't change it, and we don't have the wherewithal, the resilience, the means to actually survive healthily in that culture, then we have to practice conscientious objection and we have to leave. We've got to depart. And then another thing is play. We need to have fun. This is, and Shonda Rhimes, who's a television writer and producer, is just amazing. She talks about being sort of obsessed with work and then, losing her feel for it, being touched by it. And she started to play with her kids, and it completely brought her back to who she really was. So she can bring that sensibility back into the workplace. Yeah, so those are just some kinds of
Puppies are good too.
perspectives.
Puppies are very good. Puppy videos and
Yeah,
playing
puppy
with puppies
videos.
or actually get me in that same space. But, so let's say that you actually look at that litmus test and say, wow, I'm not even sure if my job passes this, this right livelihood metric. And at the same time, I have a family that I need to feed, clothe, educate, and I can't, how do I actually do what's right for me, not harming for myself? But then I have this family that I care about. So if I harm them, it's also, if I don't have this job, it's going to harm them and then harm myself indirectly. So, I could look at those things. Am I not having fun? I'm in a toxic work environment? But those are things as a life coach, and I hear people saying, well, I just can't go. What are your thoughts about this interdependency and how to kind of break that down?
Well, I hear you. It's easy for people like us to say these are the sort of parameters of health that we have to relate to. But, they're the people who have to work in jobs that are kind of harmful in order to support their kids, in order to send them to school. And so it's a real balancing process of what our priorities are. And if that's our priority, then, our kids are our priority, taking care of them, having medicine for them, sending them to school, feeding them, having a decent place to live. Then, even though we're doing things that are really hard to do, we do them with a different attitude.
Mm-hmm. You mean an attitude of, I'm doing this for my family and I come from a place of love? Or what would the
That's right.
attitude?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. This has been so lovely talking to you. I feel
Oh,
like
you're wonderful. You've got great vibes.
I feel like I've been trying to jam a whole book that I haven't even read because it's not even out yet into 50 minutes. So I appreciate you going at a clip that just feels probably maniacal. So thank you.
One thing I
Yes.
want to mention, the
Yeah.
last section of the book is about
Yeah.
compassion. And the lever that transforms all of these fraught states is, in fact, compassion. And neuroscience and social psychology has been made it very clear to all of us that there's no actual downside to compassion. So we'll save that maybe for another
I would
conversation.
love once I get the book, I'll read it and we'll talk about that
Great.
piece.
Wonderful.
So lovely talking to you. For folks out there, we have Roshi Joan Halifax, who is going to be coming to Seattle. Yay! And her book, of which we've gotten a preview of, is coming out on May 1st. So you can find it on Amazon. I'm sure you can find it all over the place. I know it's already like one of the top bestsellers and hasn't even been launched yet. So that's fantastic. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, CJ. It's been a joy.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. Would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show, or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.